Max's ears perked up the moment their patrol car turned into the Atlanta Municipal Animal Shelter parking lot. Sarah Collins noticed the subtle shift in her partner's posture. 6 years of working together had taught her to read every twitch of his muscles, every angle of his alert German shepherd frame. "Easy, boy," she murmured, adjusting her tactical belt as she stepped out into the humid Georgia morning. The familiar weight of her service weapon and radio felt reassuring against her hip. Just a routine inspection. The shelter's weathered brick facade looked innocent enough, but anonymous tips about animal mistreatment had been trickling into the department for weeks. As one of Atlanta PD's most experienced K-9 teams, Sarah and Max had seen their share of disturbing cases, from drug trafficking operations that stretched across 3 counties to human trafficking rings that operated in the shadows of the city's industrial districts. Animal cruelty investigations always hit different, maybe because Max understood exactly what was at stake. Helen Morrison, the shelter director, emerged from the main building with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was a woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun and nervous energy that seemed to radiate from her thin frame. "Officer Collins, thank you for coming so quickly. I'm sure this is all just a misunderstanding." Sarah nodded professionally, but her instincts were already tingling. In her decade on the force, she'd learned to trust those warning signals almost as much as she trusted Max's nose. The woman's voice had a slight tremor, and her hands kept fidgeting with the clipboard she carried. "We'll make this as smooth as possible, Ms. Morrison. Standard protocol. We'll inspect the facilities, check the records, and interview staff members. Shouldn't take more than a few hours." As they walked toward the main kennel area, the cacophony of barking dogs filled the air. The shelter housed over 100 animals, their voices creating a symphony of need and hope that always tugged at Sarah's heart. But Max suddenly veered left toward a fenced outdoor yard, completely abandoning the path they'd been following. His gait changed from casual patrol to focused investigation mode, shoulders lowered, nose working overtime, every step deliberate. "Max, heel!" Sarah commanded, but her partner ignored her completely. That alone was unusual enough to make her pause. Max had never disobeyed a direct command, not once in their 6 years together. He was the most disciplined dog she'd ever worked with, a trait that had saved both their lives more times than she could count. The dog circled a specific corner of the yard, near where a chain-link fence met a concrete retaining wall. His whining grew more insistent, punctuated by sharp barks that echoed off the surrounding buildings. The sound cut through the general noise of the shelter, urgent and demanding. "Is there something buried there?" Sarah asked Morrison, whose face had gone pale beneath her foundation. "No, nothing that I know of. Sometimes the dogs bury toys or bones. You know how it is." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. But Max wasn't acting like he'd found a buried toy. His behavior reminded Sarah of the time they'd uncovered a cache of cocaine hidden beneath a warehouse floor in East Atlanta. The same intense focus, the same refusal to be distracted, the same electric energy that seemed to charge the air around him when he was on to something big. "Max, what is it?" Sarah knelt beside her partner, running her hand along his back. His muscles were coiled tight, every fiber of his being concentrated on whatever lay beneath that seemingly innocent patch of dirt. His breathing was quick and shallow, the way it got when he was working a scent that excited him. 2 shelter employees had gathered at the fence, watching nervously. Sarah caught their exchange of worried glances, the way they kept checking Morrison's reaction, the subtle way they'd stepped closer to each other as if seeking comfort. One was a young man with multiple tattoos covering his arms, the other a middle-aged woman whose uniform bore the stains of a day's work with animals. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to explain why my dog is so interested in this spot," Sarah said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone that had served her well in countless investigations. Morrison's hands trembled as she adjusted her clipboard. "I honestly don't know. Maybe there's a dead animal down there. Sometimes strays wander onto the property but Sarah was no longer listening. Max had begun digging with his front paws, ignoring her repeated commands to stop. Dirt flew in small clouds as he worked with single-minded determination, his claws scraping against something harder than soil. And then Sarah saw it, a flash of something white beneath the surface. Not bone, not plastic. Something that definitely shouldn't be buried in an animal shelter yard. The edge of what looked like PVC pipe, too perfectly round and clean to be natural. Her radio crackled to life with routine dispatch chatter, but she barely heard the familiar voices. Every instinct she'd developed as a cop was screaming that they'd stumbled onto something much bigger than animal mistreatment, the kind of discovery that turned routine inspections into major investigations. Max looked up at her, dirt coating his black nose, his dark eyes holding that familiar intelligence that never failed to amaze her. In that moment, Sarah knew their routine inspection had just become something else entirely. "Morrison," she said quietly, her hand moving instinctively toward her radio. "I think we need to have a much longer conversation." Sarah's hands shook slightly as she ended the call with Judge Martinez. Getting a search warrant approved in under 2 hours was practically unheard of, but the urgency in her voice and Max's unwavering behavior at the dig site had convinced the judge that immediate action was necessary. "Warrants approved," she announced to the small crowd that had gathered in the shelter's main office. Morrison sat hunched in her chair, her clipboard forgotten on the desk, while Detective James Rodriguez from Atlanta PD's Major Crimes Unit reviewed the paperwork Sarah had hastily prepared. Max hadn't moved from his position in the yard. Even now, through the office window, Sarah could see him sitting perfectly still beside the disturbed patch of earth, like a sentinel guarding secrets that were about to be revealed. "Let's see what your partner found," Rodriguez said, adjusting his tie as they headed back outside. He was a veteran investigator who'd worked with Sarah on several cases, and his presence meant the department was taking this seriously. The excavation equipment arrived within minutes, a small backhoe operated by city maintenance, along with evidence collection kits and photography equipment. Sarah kept Max at a safe distance as the machine began carefully removing layers of soil, but she could feel his intense focus on every scoop of dirt that emerged. "There," Rodriguez pointed as something white and cylindrical became fully visible. "Definitely PVC pipe, industrial grade, by the looks of it." Sarah's pulse quickened. This wasn't random debris or old plumbing. The pipe was newer, cleaner, and positioned horizontally in a way that suggested intentional placement. As more earth was removed, the scope of the discovery became clear. They were looking at a tunnel entrance, roughly 4 feet in diameter, that disappeared into darkness beneath the shelter's foundation. "Jesus Christ," Rodriguez muttered, kneeling beside the opening. He activated his flashlight and peered into the depths. "This thing goes way back. Professional construction, too. Sarah, this isn't some amateur operation." Max whined softly, straining against his leash as if desperate to explore the tunnel himself. Sarah had seen that look before, during the warehouse raid that had led to the arrest of 3 major drug dealers, and again when they'd uncovered the human trafficking safehouse in Buckhead. Her partner's instincts had never led them astray. Morrison had gone completely silent, her face ashen as she watched the excavation proceed. When Sarah approached her with questions about the tunnel's origins, the woman could only shake her head repeatedly, claiming ignorance that rang increasingly hollow. "Ms. Morrison," Sarah said firmly, "this tunnel runs directly under your facility. Construction like this doesn't happen overnight, and it certainly doesn't happen without someone noticing." "I swear to you I had no idea," Morrison whispered, but her eyes darted nervously toward the tunnel entrance. "Maybe it's old, from before I started working here?" Rodriguez emerged from his preliminary exploration of the tunnel, his flashlight beam dancing across the walls of the pipe. "Sarah, you need to see this. The tunnel extends at least 50 yards, maybe more. It's not just a pipe. There are electrical lines, ventilation shafts, even what looks like motion sensors." Sarah felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with major discoveries. This was no abandoned sewer line or forgotten utility tunnel. Someone had invested serious time and money into creating a sophisticated underground passage, and they'd done it right under the nose of the city's animal control department. "Where does it lead?" she asked, already dreading the answer. "Ends at what looks like an old warehouse foundation about 2 blocks east of here. The whole thing's been expertly concealed on both ends." Rodriguez wiped dirt from his hands and met Sarah's gaze. "This is organized crime-level infrastructure. We're talking about months of planning and construction." Max suddenly tensed, his attention shifting from the tunnel to something else entirely. Sarah followed his gaze and noticed for the first time how the shelter's 2 employees had positioned themselves near the back exit, their body language suggesting they were ready to bolt at any moment. "Don't even think about it," Sarah called out, her hand instinctively moving to her radio. "Nobody leaves until we've had a chance to talk to everyone." The younger employee, whose name tag read Kevin, raised his hands defensively. "We're not going anywhere, officer. We want to help however we can." But his nervous energy told a different story, and Sarah had learned long ago to trust non-verbal cues over verbal assurances. Kevin's co-worker, Maria, kept glancing between the tunnel entrance and Morrison, as if waiting for some kind of signal. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah announced, her voice carrying the authority that had earned her respect throughout the Atlanta PD. "This facility is now a crime scene. Nobody enters or leaves without my permission. We're going to conduct interviews with every staff member, and we're going to find out exactly what this tunnel has been used for." Rodriguez nodded his agreement and began coordinating with the evidence technicians who had just arrived. The shelter yard was quickly transformed into a bustling investigation site, with photographers documenting every angle of the tunnel entrance and evidence collectors preparing to explore its depths. Max remained focused on the tunnel, but Sarah noticed something else in his behavior, a subtle agitation that suggested the scents he was detecting weren't just from construction materials or stagnant air. There was something else down there, something that triggered his training in ways that made Sarah's cop instincts scream warnings. As the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across the excavation site, Sarah realized they had stumbled onto something that would likely keep them busy for days, if not weeks. The tunnel was just the beginning, a gateway to secrets that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide. Morrison sat on a nearby bench, her head in her hands, looking like a woman whose world was collapsing around her. Whether she was a victim or a conspirator remained to be seen, but Sarah was determined to find out which. "Rodriguez," she called to her colleague, "I think we're going to need more backup, and maybe someone from the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force." Max looked up at her with those intelligent dark eyes, and Sarah could swear she saw approval in his gaze. Whatever they had uncovered, her partner was ready to see it through to the end. The tunnel stretched ahead of them, like a dark promise of revelations yet to come. The warehouse at the tunnel's end told a story that made Sarah's stomach turn. Evidence technicians had spent 3 hours documenting the underground chamber, but it was Max who led them to the most damning discovery, a collection of cages, medical equipment, and betting sheets that painted a picture of systematic cruelty. "Dog fighting," Rodriguez confirmed grimly, examining a ledger filled with names, dates, and dollar amounts. "This isn't small-time backyard stuff, Sarah. We're looking at a major operation." Sarah knelt beside Max, who had been unusually quiet since they'd entered the warehouse space. The smell of fear and violence lingered in the concrete walls, and she could see the tension in her partner's shoulders as he processed scents that spoke of canine suffering. But it was the discovery of a second ledger that changed everything. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard, the book contained not just records of fights and bets, but detailed information about animals taken from the shelter, their breeds, sizes, temperaments, and fighting potential. "Jesus," Rodriguez whispered, flipping through pages of handwritten notes. "They've been using the shelter as a recruitment center. Look at this. German Shepherd mix, kennelled 615, good size for training, potential pit fighter." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. The betrayal cut deep. Someone had turned a place meant to save animals into a supplier for their torture and death. Max pressed against her leg, offering comfort in the way only he could. The name at the bottom of most entries was consistent: Marcus Steele Rodriguez. No relation to Detective Rodriguez, despite the shared surname. Sarah had heard whispers about Steele Rodriguez in her years working Atlanta's streets. He was a ghost, a criminal who operated through intermediaries and never left fingerprints on his operations. "We need to talk to Morrison again," Sarah said, her voice hard with determination. "There's no way this happens without inside help." When they returned to the shelter, they found Helen Morrison in her office, staring blankly at a photograph on her desk. Sarah recognized the image, a teenage girl with Morrison's eyes and smile, wearing a college graduation cap. "My daughter?" Morrison said without being asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's 22, just graduated from Georgia State with her teaching degree." Sarah exchanged glances with Rodriguez. Something in Morrison's tone suggested this wasn't just a proud parent sharing family photos. "Ms. Morrison," Sarah began gently, "we found the warehouse. We know about the dog-fighting operation. We need you to tell us everything." Morrison's composure finally cracked. Tears streamed down her face as she reached into her desk drawer and withdrew a manila envelope. With trembling hands, she spilled its contents onto the desktop. Photographs that made Sarah's blood run cold. The images showed Morrison in what appeared to be a hotel room, engaged in activities that would destroy her reputation and career if made public. But it was the man in the photos that caught Sarah's attention. Someone who looked like he belonged in a motorcycle gang, with distinctive tattoos covering his arms and neck. "They said they'd send these to my daughter's school district," Morrison sobbed. "She just got her first teaching job. If these got out, she'd never work in education again. Neither would I." Rodriguez leaned forward, his voice professionally calm despite the situation's emotional weight. "How long has this been going on, Helen?" "6 months. Morrison whispered. "They approached me at a bar after work. I was lonely, my husband had just left me, and this man seemed charming. I thought it was just a fling. Then the photographs showed up in my mailbox, with instructions." Sarah felt a familiar anger building in her chest, not just at the criminals who had orchestrated this, but at the system that allowed predators to exploit vulnerable people with such calculated precision. "What did they want you to do?" Sarah asked. Morrison wiped her eyes with a tissue, struggling to compose herself. "They needed access to the intake records, information about dogs that came in, their breeds, temperaments, how long they'd been here. They also needed me to delay any inspections or investigations if officials came asking questions." "You've been selecting dogs for them," Rodriguez stated bluntly. Morrison nodded miserably. "Not directly. I would just leave certain files where their contact could see them, and sometimes I delay the adoption process for specific animals, claiming they needed more behavioral evaluation." Max whined softly, as if understanding the conversation's implications. Sarah reached down to stroke his head, drawing strength from his steady presence. "Who was your contact?" Sarah pressed. "A man named Tony. I never knew his last name. He'd come by once or twice a week, always during evening hours when most staff had gone home. He'd look at the files, sometimes walk through the kennels, and make his selections." Sarah's mind raced through the implications. This wasn't just a criminal enterprise. It was a sophisticated operation that had infiltrated legitimate institutions and corrupted them from within. The tunnel wasn't just for smuggling animals. It was part of a larger infrastructure designed to operate with impunity. "Helen," Rodriguez said firmly, "we need you to help us catch these people. You're a victim here, but you're also our best chance at stopping this operation before more animals suffer." Morrison looked up with red-rimmed eyes, hope flickering across her face for the first time since the interviews began. "Will you help protect my daughter? If I cooperate, what happens to those photos?" Sarah met the woman's gaze directly. "We'll do everything we can to keep your family safe. But Helen, this operation has been running for months. How many dogs do you think have died because of what you've been forced to do?" The question hung in the air like a physical weight. Morrison's shoulders shook with renewed sobbing, but when she looked up again, Sarah saw something that hadn't been there before: resolve. "Whatever you need me to do," Morrison said firmly, "I'll do it. I should have come forward months ago, but I was too scared. I can't live with this anymore." Max stood and walked to Morrison, gently placing his head against her knee in a gesture of comfort that surprised Sarah. Even after everything they'd discovered, her partner's capacity for forgiveness and understanding remained intact. "All right," Sarah said, pulling out her notepad. "Let's start with everything you know about Steele Rodriguez and his operation. It's time to bring these bastards down." Outside, the Atlanta sun was setting, casting long shadows across the shelter grounds. But inside the office, 3 humans and 1 very special dog were planning to shine light into corners that had been dark for far too long. The surveillance van parked 3 blocks from the shelter had been Sarah and Rodriguez's second home for the past week. Inside the cramped space, banks of monitors displayed feeds from hidden cameras they'd installed throughout the facility, while Max lay curled at Sarah's feet, his ears twitching at every sound from the speakers. "Movement at the east entrance," Rodriguez whispered, pointing to one of the screens. A figure in dark clothing was approaching the tunnel entrance, moving with the careful precision of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Sarah's pulse quickened. After 7 days of waiting, their patience was finally paying off. Morrison had played her part perfectly, leaving coded messages and maintaining the facade of cooperation, while federal agents worked to trace the full extent of Steele Rodriguez's criminal network. "That's Tony." Morrison's voice crackled through the earpiece she wore. She was positioned in her office, following the script they'd rehearsed dozens of times. "He's early tonight." Through the thermal imaging camera, Sarah watched as Tony, real name Anthony Castellanos, according to FBI records, descended into the tunnel system. The man moved with practiced efficiency, clearly familiar with the underground route that connected the shelter to the warehouse facility. Max raised his head, sensing the tension that had filled the van. Sarah reached down to stroke his neck, drawing comfort from his steady presence. In a few hours, they would be putting themselves in harm's way to shut down an operation that had tortured and killed dozens of innocent animals. "Teams are in position," Rodriguez confirmed, speaking into his radio. "Federal agents have the warehouse surrounded, and Atlanta PD has units stationed at all possible exit points." The plan was complex but necessary. They needed to catch the operation in progress, with enough evidence to ensure convictions that would stick. That meant waiting for the actual dogfight to begin, documenting the criminal activity, and then moving in with overwhelming force. Sarah's stomach tightened as she watched the monitors. Intelligence suggested tonight's event would involve at least 6 dogs, including 2 that had been taken from the shelter within the past month. The thought of what those animals had endured in preparation for this night made her want to abandon the careful plan and storm the facility immediately. "Easy," Rodriguez murmured, reading her expression. "We stick to the timeline. Rushing in now means some of these bastards walk free." The next hour passed with agonizing slowness. More figures appeared on the surveillance feeds, men in expensive suits who looked like they belonged in corporate boardrooms, alongside others whose tattoos and gang colors told different stories. The betting money alone would likely exceed 6 figures, making this one of the largest illegal gambling operations Atlanta had seen in years. Morrison's voice came through the earpiece again, tight with barely controlled fear. 2 more men just entered through the main tunnel. I think one of them might be Steele Rodriguez himself." Sarah's attention snapped to the monitors. The figure Morrison had identified was tall and powerfully built, with the kind of presence that commanded respect through intimidation. Even on the grainy surveillance footage, Sarah could see the deference other criminals showed him. "That's our primary target," Rodriguez confirmed, cross-referencing the image with FBI photos. Marcus Steele Rodriguez, finally showing his face. Max suddenly stood, his body tensing in a way that Sarah recognized. Her partner was picking up sounds or scents that the electronic surveillance couldn't detect, his natural abilities providing intelligence that no technology could match. "Something's wrong," Sarah whispered, trusting Max's instincts more than the equipment around them. Her partner's ears were rotating like radar dishes, tracking sounds that seemed to be coming from multiple directions. Then Sarah heard it too. Vehicles approaching from different angles, engines running quiet, but not silent. "Rodriguez, we've got company," she said urgently into her radio. "Multiple vehicles converging on our position." The response came back immediately, filled with tension. "Warehouse team reports unusual activity. Looks like they're moving the operation." Sarah's worst fears were confirmed as she watched the surveillance monitors. Instead of the expected dogfight, the criminals were hastily packing equipment and moving animals through the tunnel system. Someone had tipped them off about the operation. "We've been compromised," Rodriguez said grimly, reaching for his service weapon. "All units, move in now. Repeat, all units converge immediately." The van's doors burst open as Sarah and Rodriguez prepared to join the coordinated assault. Max leaped out ahead of them, his training taking over as he processed the rapidly changing tactical situation. Gunfire erupted from the direction of the warehouse, followed by shouts and the sound of vehicles racing away at high speed. Sarah's radio crackled with reports from multiple units, some suspects in custody, others fleeing in various directions, and still Rodriguez nowhere to be found. "Sarah, we need Max at the tunnel entrance," came Rodriguez's voice through the static. "Some of the animals are still down there, and we need to know if any suspects are hiding in the system." Without hesitation, Sarah and Max sprinted toward the shelter, their practice partnership allowing them to move as one unit through the chaos. Behind them, the sounds of the failed operation continued, sirens, shouting, and the occasional burst of gunfire as pursuing officers attempted to apprehend fleeing criminals. At the tunnel entrance, Max immediately went to work, his nose leading him into the darkness below. Sarah followed with her flashlight, trusting her partner to guide them safely through the underground maze. What they found in the tunnel system made Sarah's heart race. Cages containing 5 dogs, all showing signs of abuse and training for combat. The animals were terrified, but alive, their eyes reflecting Sarah's flashlight beam like desperate prayers for rescue. "We've got survivors," Sarah reported through her radio. 5 dogs, all appearing to need immediate veterinary attention. But Max wasn't finished. He led Sarah deeper into the tunnel, to a section they hadn't fully explored during their initial investigation. Hidden behind a false wall, they discovered additional evidence: computers, financial records, and most importantly, a detailed list of upcoming fights scheduled at different locations throughout the southeast. "Rodriguez," Sarah called through her radio. "We've got intelligence on the entire network. This operation is bigger than we thought." As they emerged from the tunnel with the rescued animals, Sarah could see the mixed results of their night's work. Several mid-level criminals were in custody, along with dozens of spectators who had come to watch the brutal entertainment. But Steele Rodriguez and his core lieutenants had escaped, taking with them the knowledge and connections needed to rebuild their operation elsewhere. Max looked up at Sarah with those intelligent eyes, and she could see the same mixture of satisfaction and frustration that she felt. They had saved lives tonight, but the war against cruelty was far from over. "Don't worry, boy," Sarah murmured, scratching behind Max's ears as emergency veterinarians began examining the rescued dogs. "This isn't finished. We'll get the rest of them." The night air was filled with the sounds of justice in progress, but also with the knowledge that somewhere in the darkness, Marcus Rodriguez was already planning his next move. 3 days after the failed raid, Sarah's phone buzzed with the call she'd been expecting. Morrison's trembling voice delivered the message they'd all been waiting for. Steele Rodriguez was coming back. "He's furious about the losses," Morrison whispered into her phone, huddled in her car outside a downtown Atlanta coffee shop. "Tony says they're moving the entire operation tonight. One final fight to recoup their money, then they're shutting down permanently." Sarah exchanged glances with Rodriguez, who was monitoring the call from the passenger seat of their unmarked patrol car. Max sat alert in the back, sensing the tension that had gripped both officers since the surveillance operation had gone sideways. "Where?" Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer. "The warehouse. Tony said Rodriguez wants to use the tunnel system one last time before they abandon it. He's bringing in 2 champion fighters from out of state, and the betting minimum is $20,000. The stakes couldn't have been higher." Intelligence suggested Rodriguez had become increasingly desperate and dangerous, since their operation had cost him nearly $250,000 in lost revenue and equipment. A cornered criminal with nothing left to lose was the most dangerous kind. "Morrison, listen carefully," Sarah said. "You've done everything we've asked. After tonight, this is over. Your daughter will be safe, and you can start rebuilding your life." But even as she said the words, Sarah knew the night ahead would test every skill she and Max had developed over their 6 years together. Rodriguez wouldn't make the same mistakes twice, and he'd have nothing left to lose. The warehouse district after midnight felt like a different world. Empty buildings stretched in all directions, their broken windows staring down like dead eyes at the deserted streets below. Sarah and Max moved silently through the shadows, part of a coordinated assault team that included FBI agents, Atlanta PD SWAT units, and animal control officers equipped to handle traumatized fighting dogs. "Thermal imaging confirms at least 30 people inside the warehouse," came the whispered report through Sarah's earpiece. "Multiple heat signatures in the basement level, consistent with animal activity." Sarah's jaw clenched. 30 spectators meant this was one of Rodriguez's premium events, the kind that attracted wealthy gamblers from across the southeast. The amount of money changing hands would be enormous, but more importantly, the suffering of the animals involved would be beyond description. Max pressed against her leg, offering silent support as they approached their assigned entry point. The plan called for simultaneous breaches from multiple directions, overwhelming Rodriguez's security before he could harm the animals or escape through one of several possible exit routes. "All teams, green light in 60 seconds. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio. Sarah checked her equipment one final time: service weapon, flashlight, protective gear, and most importantly, the bond with her partner that had never failed them. Max looked up at her, and in his dark eyes she saw the same determination that had carried them through every dangerous situation they'd faced together. The warehouse basement erupted in chaos as 4 separate teams breached the facility simultaneously. Shouts, sirens, and the sounds of panicking criminals filled the air, but Sarah's focus narrowed to a single objective: finding and neutralizing Marcus Rodriguez before he could hurt anyone else. Max led her through the maze of basement corridors, his nose guiding them past fleeing gamblers and toward the source of the most intense scents. The underground facility was larger than their intelligence had suggested, with multiple chambers connected by narrow passages that seemed designed to confuse intruders. They found Rodriguez in the main fighting arena, a circular pit surrounded by stadium seating that could accommodate over 100 spectators. But instead of fleeing like his customers and employees, Steel Rodriguez stood in the center of the pit, flanked by 2 massive pit bulls whose scars told stories of previous battles. "Officer Collins," Rodriguez called out, his voice carrying a twisted note of respect. "I was hoping we'd get a chance to meet face to face." Sarah kept her weapon trained on him, acutely aware that Max was focused on the 2 fighting dogs with professional intensity. The animals showed signs of severe abuse and chemical enhancement, their eyes holding the vacant stare of creatures pushed beyond their natural limits. "It's over, Rodriguez," Sarah called back. "Your operation is finished, your people are in custody, and there's nowhere left to run." Rodriguez laughed, a sound devoid of humor or humanity. "You cost me everything, officer. My money, my reputation, my business. I figure the least you can do is watch me recoup some of my losses." The criminal pulled a remote control from his pocket, and Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized what he intended. The fighting dogs began circling each other, their training overriding their fear as Rodriguez prepared to force them into combat one final time. "Don't do this," Sarah pleaded, knowing that stopping the fight would require her to enter the pit and expose herself to extreme danger. "These animals have suffered enough." Audacious, but Rodriguez's finger was already moving toward the remote's activation button, his face twisted with the kind of rage that came from a lifetime of treating living creatures as disposable commodities. Max made the decision for both of them. The German Shepherd launched himself over the barrier surrounding the pit, landing between the two fighting dogs with a bark that carried 6 years of law enforcement authority. His presence immediately changed the dynamic in the arena, as both pit bulls responded to the confident energy of a dog who had never known defeat or abuse. Sarah vaulted over the barrier after her partner, her weapon trained on Rodriguez, while Max worked his own kind of magic with the traumatized animals. The fighting dogs' aggressive postures began to soften as they encountered a canine who radiated calm confidence instead of fear or violence. "Impossible," Rodriguez snarled, raising his remote control like a weapon. "Those dogs are trained killers. They don't respond to anything but violence." But Max was proving him wrong with every passing second. The German Shepherd moved between the pit bulls with careful diplomacy, using body language and soft vocalizations to communicate in ways that transcended the brutal conditioning they'd endured. Within minutes, both fighting dogs were sitting calmly, their attention focused on Max rather than each other. Rodriguez's face contorted with fury as he realized his final gambit had failed. "If I can't have my fight, then nobody gets anything." The criminal lunged toward Sarah with a knife that seemed to materialize from nowhere, but Max was already in motion. The German Shepherd intercepted Rodriguez with precision timing, knocking the man off balance without inflicting serious injury. Sarah's tackle brought Rodriguez to the ground as backup officers flooded into the arena. The final confrontation was over in seconds, but the image of Max standing protectively over two former fighting dogs would remain with Sarah for the rest of her career. "Good boy," Sarah whispered, kneeling beside her partner as Rodriguez was led away in handcuffs. "The best boy." Max looked up at her with those intelligent eyes, and Sarah could swear she saw satisfaction in his gaze. They had saved lives tonight, and more importantly, they had proven that compassion could triumph over cruelty even in the darkest places. Around them, animal control officers began the delicate process of rescuing dogs that had been bred and trained for violence, but who still retained the capacity for gentleness. It would be a long road to rehabilitation, but tonight had proven that no animal was beyond redemption. The warehouse basement gradually emptied as evidence was collected and suspects were processed, but Sarah remained in the pit with Max and the two former fighting dogs, offering the first kindness they had probably experienced in years. Justice was finally within reach. 6 months after the warehouse confrontation, Sarah stood in the Fulton County Superior Court as Judge Martinez delivered the final sentences in the case that had consumed her life. Marcus Steele Rodriguez sat at the defendant's table, his once commanding presence diminished by the orange jumpsuit and shackles that marked his fall from criminal kingpin to convicted felon. "Mr. Rodriguez," Judge Martinez intoned, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "you have been found guilty on 47 counts, including animal cruelty, racketeering, money laundering, and operating an illegal gambling enterprise. The court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." Sarah felt Max shift beside her in the gallery, his ears perking up at the sound of the gavel striking the bench. Her partner had been granted special permission to attend the sentencing, a recognition of his crucial role in bringing the criminal organization to justice. The sentences for Rodriguez's associates followed in rapid succession. Tony Castellanos received 15 years for his role as the operation's primary recruiter and enforcer. 3 other lieutenants were sentenced to terms ranging from 8 to 12 years, while the warehouse owner and several equipment suppliers received shorter sentences in exchange for their cooperation. but it was Helen Morrison's sentencing that had weighed most heavily on Sarah's mind. The former shelter director stood before the judge with quiet dignity, having spent the past 6 months working with prosecutors to dismantle every aspect of Rodriguez's network. "Ms. Morrison," Judge Martinez said, his tone noticeably softer, "your cooperation has been instrumental in achieving justice for the animals who suffered in this operation. While your actions were inexcusable, the court recognizes that you were a victim of extortion and blackmail. You are sentenced to 2 years of supervised probation and 500 hours of community service at animal rescue organizations." Sarah watched as Morrison's shoulders sagged with relief. The woman had lost her job and her reputation, but she would be able to rebuild her life and maintain her relationship with her daughter, who had stood by her throughout the ordeal. Outside the courthouse, Sarah was approached by Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the veterinarian who had been treating the rescued fighting dogs. The news she brought was better than Sarah had dared to hope. "Titan and Brutus have both been cleared for adoption," Dr. Walsh reported, referring to the 2 pit bulls Max had pacified during the final confrontation. "Their rehabilitation has been remarkable. It turns out that beneath all that conditioning, they're just dogs who want to be loved." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she thought about the journey those animals had traveled, from the violence of the fighting pit to the possibility of loving homes. Max wagged his tail, as if understanding the significance of the veterinarian's words. "What about the others?" Sarah asked. 14 of the 17 dogs we rescued have been successfully rehabilitated and adopted," Dr. Walsh continued. "The remaining 3 will need more time, but we're optimistic about their progress. None of them will ever have to fight again." The numbers told a story of both triumph and tragedy. 17 dogs saved, but evidence suggested dozens more had died in Rodriguez's operation over the years. The victory was significant, but it came at a cost that would always weigh on Sarah's conscience. Detective Rodriguez, no relation to the criminal they'd pursued, joined them on the courthouse steps, carrying a folder filled with updates on the broader investigation. The intelligence they'd gathered from the warehouse computers had led to arrests in 3 other states and the shutdown of 2 additional fighting operations. "The FBI task force estimates we disrupted a network responsible for over 300 illegal fights across the southeast," he reported. "Rodriguez's operation was just the tip of the iceberg, but it was the most sophisticated and profitable we've ever encountered." Sarah nodded, understanding that their work had ripple effects extending far beyond Atlanta's city limits. Every criminal network they dismantled made it harder for others to operate, and every successful prosecution sent a message that animal cruelty would not be tolerated. The Atlanta Municipal Animal Shelter had been completely reorganized under new management, with enhanced security protocols and mandatory background checks for all employees. The tunnel system had been permanently sealed, and the facility now served as a model for other shelters seeking to prevent criminal infiltration. As they walked back to their patrol car, Sarah reflected on how the case had changed both her and Max. Their partnership had always been strong, but the underground confrontation had revealed new depths to their bond. Max had shown not just courage and training, but a kind of wisdom that transcended typical police work. "You know what the best part is?" Sarah said to Max as they settled into their patrol car. "Those 2 fighting dogs you helped rescue? They're going to families with children, kids who will love them and show them what life is supposed to be like." Max tilted his head, listening with the focused attention that had made him such an exceptional partner. Sarah could swear she saw understanding in his dark eyes, along with something that looked remarkably like satisfaction. Their radio crackled to life with a new call, a domestic disturbance in East Atlanta that required a K-9 response. As they pulled away from the courthouse, Sarah felt the familiar surge of purpose that came with each new mission. The Rodriguez case had been closed, justice had been served, and 17 dogs were living proof that even in the darkest circumstances, hope could triumph over cruelty. But Sarah and Max's work was far from finished. Somewhere in the city, other victims needed their help. Other criminals needed to be brought to justice. As they drove through the streets of Atlanta, Sarah reached over to scratch behind Max's ears. 6 years of partnership had taught her to trust his instincts completely, and those instincts were already focusing on whatever challenge lay ahead. The radio dispatcher's voice filled the car with details of their next assignment, but Sarah's mind lingered for a moment on the image of Titan and Brutus playing in suburban backyards with children who would never know about their violent past. Sometimes justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about redemption and second chances. Max looked up at her with those intelligent eyes, ready for whatever came next. Together, they had proven that loyalty, courage, and compassion could overcome even the most organized cruelty. The city stretched out before them, full of possibilities for making a difference one case at a time. Sarah stepped on the accelerator, and they drove toward their next opportunity to serve and protect, carrying with them the knowledge that justice, once achieved, had the power to heal wounds that seemed impossible to repair. Their story continued, written in the lives they touched and the criminals they stopped, one investigation at a time.